I wish to speak about a question which has been the focus for my philosophical interests for the past 20 years. The existence of and the importance of knowledge outside of the mature sciences. I call this non-scientific knowledge in a non-prejudicial sense of the term non-scientific. And in particular, I include under this label of non-scientific knowledge the existence of knowledge of values in the widest sense. It's in the widest sense because I don't mean to limit that to so-called ethical or moral values. It is, at least in philosophical parlance, if not in ordinary parlance, a value judgment to say that anything is better or worse than anything else, a better way of life, or a better course of action, or a better theory in science, or a better interpretation of a text. In particular, philosophers, even if they don't do literary theory, are constantly arguing about what's the better interpretation of one or another philosophical text, even contemporary articles. And by mature sciences, I mean, again, in a non-prejudicial sense, and without it's a bad term, I should really change that because that implies somehow that the other sciences are immature or that all sciences aspire to maturity in some one pattern. And I realize now that I don't like that mature sciences. But I should say perhaps the paradigmatic sciences. I mean, and I take that for better or worse, our paradigm of a science is physics. But I'll say a little more about that. So this focus on the idea, which I think is enormously important, that their knowledge is not confined to the kind of knowledge that we find in physics, molecular biology, chemistry, and nor should all knowledge aspire to resemble the knowledge we have in these paradigmatic sciences. That focus has naturally led me to point out how our paradigmatic science, which I take to be physics, itself depends on judgments which are non-scientific. It's not that there's this wonderful stuff all by itself called paradigmatic science, and then there's this other stuff which some people think is second-rate and some people think is even better, called non-scientific knowledge. But science itself is like an iceberg floating on an ocean of non-scientific knowledge, of what Kant called good judgment. Now, this has led me into the controversial question of how it's possible for value claims to be objective. And that in turn led me to a close reading of the American pragmatists, who were my predecessors in the study of all of these problems. Fortunately, I had a few courses in them in college, even if I've forgotten that for a number of decades in between. What I would like to do tonight is give an account of the general conclusions to which I've come, and in contrast to last Thursday's lecture, which was technical, to do so in as non-technical a way as possible. Now, this is not something that philosophers very often do nowadays. This is not something we Anglo-American philosophers, Anglo-Australian American philosophers, are not socialized to do this. We're socialized to do for a strange ritual in which we read papers to one another on some fairly well-defined topic. But if philosophy is to retain its connection to the wide human concerns, which have always been its very reason for existence, every so often a philosopher must speak not as a channel for a particular argument or thesis, but as an individual who embodies a point of view. A point of view which, like all human points of view, has a formulation which is idiosyncratic, but which the philosopher hopes embodies insights that are something more than idiosyncratic at the end. For this reason, I shall allow myself not only to sketch a point of view rather than argue for it in detail, but I shall allow myself to explain why I hold it but in part by describing the particular way in which it developed in the course of my writing and teaching, or at least the sequence of sections of this paper pretty much parallels the way this point of view developed in my own thinking. So to begin with, the first point I'd like to make, and I'd say this was the first point that occurred to me, developed in this sequence of thoughts in my life, there's no possibility, contrary to what some philosophers have hoped for, of a rigorous demarcation between science and non-science. This is a big argument, especially between Sir Karl Popper and Rudolf Carnap, when I was a student and when I was a junior faculty member. But I realized a long time ago that there's no hope whatsoever of a clean-cut criterion of demarcation between science and non-science. For example, to the extent that there are maxims that apply to all of scientific inquiry, and I think there are, for example, make experiments. Or if that's impossible, make observations. Unless, of course, the inquiry is in pure logic or mathematics. Another maxim, which I don't see often stated in philosophy of science textbooks, is be meticulous. Yet a lot of socialization as a scientist consists of drumming that maxim into one's head. Submit, and this next one is one that John Dewey does mention, but it doesn't occur anywhere in Carnap's writing on inductive logic or in Popper's writing. Submit your work to the judgment of all who are competent in the area. Do not block, another famous pragmatist one, occurs in both Peirce and James, do not block the paths of inquiry, and I would add, or of discussion. Be fallibilistic. Well, these maxims apply to non-scientific inquiry as well. In fact, John Dewey, who stressed all of these maxims, thought that all properly conducted inquiry should be called scientific, but I think that was a mistake. We are stuck with a fuzzy distinction, even if the distinction does not mark an epistemological or metaphysical gulf. Now, I just employed the expression, a criterion of demarcation between science and non-science, an expression that's associated with the name of Karl Popper. And so I should admit that my discussion, of course, presupposes that Karl Popper's attempt to state such a criterion was a complete failure. Karl Popper's famous criterion was the difference between science and non-science is scientific theories imply testable predictions, in fact, imply predictions which are risky relative to background knowledge, and non-science does not. In technical jargon, scientific theories are falsifiable. Well, why do I say that this criterion is a complete failure? Well, for example, it excludes Darwin's theory of the origin of the species from the status of a scientific theory, and that's crazy. By the way, I should mention that Popper had rather late in his life tried to cover his tracks, but he never really gave up on that. A little evidence, since many people are under the impression that Popper repudiated his own repudiation of the theory of evolution as not a scientific theory as metaphysics. What happened is late in his life, Popper softened his rhetoric. For example, in a paper called Natural Selection and the Emergence of Mind in 1978, he wrote, I still believe that natural selection works this way, that is, as a metaphysical research program. Nevertheless, I have changed my mind about the testability and the logical status of the theory of natural selection, and I am glad to make a recantation. So what's this great recantation that we're going to get? Popper's recantation was the statement that the theory of natural selection was actually falsified. He was wrong in saying it was unfalsifiable because it was actually falsified. In order to make this astounding claim, Popper construed the theory of natural selection as claiming that, quote, everything that evolves is useful. a misunderstanding that, of course, all the great evolutionary biologists have repeatedly denounced. And he still maintained, even with this misunderstanding, that the theory that evolutionary biologists think of as the theory of evolution, which of course does not say that everything that evolves is useful, is not a scientific program at all, but, quotes, a most successful metaphysical research program. In his intellectual autobiography, Unended Quest, an Intellectual Autobiography, Popper repeats the claim that the theory of evolution is, quotes, not a testable scientific theory, unquote, and asserts that to the extent that it creates the impression that an ultimate explanation of the origin of species has been found, quotes, it is not so much better than the theistic view of adaptation. So, that's one reason for rejecting Popper's criterion of demarcation. In a paper in the volume The Philosophy of Karl Popper, I believe to have shown that Popper's falsification criterion only pretends to account for the scientific status of Newtonian physics, and that Popper engages in an enormous amount of fabulation about the actual nature of Newtonian physics. And other proposals have not succeeded any better than Popper's. But I'm also convinced that as ordinary people, we're not really troubled by the failure of whether philosophers come up or don't come up with a, quotes, criterion of demarcation. And we shouldn't be. We'll go on saying that physics is a science, in fact our paradigm, and that chemistry is a science. More recently, we've all become convinced that evolutionary biology is a science. It collects data meticulously, it has a theory which impresses us, and it has close links with subjects like molecular biology, which resemble the paradigm, even if it itself does not. And we don't call, maybe I'm speaking tendentiously or persuasively here, we don't call history or sociology science, unless we're in the sociology department. And we're pretty skeptical, or should be, about economics. And this will go on being the case unless they have successes that impress us in the way in which physics and more recently biology have impressed us. The fact that it's fuzzy, just what is and is not a science, doesn't, however, mean that just anything can be called a science. And maybe this is a little bit of ordinary language philosophy, but not only do we not call history or sociology sciences, we certainly don't call textual interpretation or ethics sciences. But as I said, science presupposes non-scientific knowledge. It was Rudolf Carnap's dream, my friend and my wife's PhD professor, for the last 3 decades of his life, to try to show that science proceeds by a formal syntactic method. Today, to my knowledge, no one holds out any hope for that project. Karl Popper rejected Carnap's inductive logic, but he too hoped to reduce the scientific method to a simple rule: test all strongly falsifiable theories and retain the ones that survive. But that works no better than this Carnap's inductive logic. For when a theory conflicts with what has previously been supposed to be fact, we sometimes give up the theory, and we sometimes give up the supposed fact, which is what Popper says we should never do. And as Quine famously put it, the decision of which to do is a matter of trade-offs, as R. Quine said, where rational, pragmatic. It's a matter of informal judgments of plausibility, simplicity, and the like. Nor is it the case that when two theories conflict, scientists do always wait until the observational data decides between them, as Popperian philosophy of science demands they should. An example I like to use in this connection is the following. It's a very little-known example, recherché, but nice. Both Einstein's theory of gravitation, and this is the recherché part, Alfred North Whitehead's 1922 theory, of which very few people have even heard, agreed with special relativity, and both predicted the familiar phenomena of the deflection of light by gravitation, the non-Newtonian character of the orbit of Mercury, the exact orbit of the Moon, etc. Yet Einstein's theory was accepted and Whitehead's theory was rejected 50 years before anyone thought of an observation that would decide between the two. Indeed, a great many theories must be rejected on non-observational grounds, on seat of the pants grounds, if you like. For the rule, test every theory that occurs to anyone is impossible to follow. As Bronowski once wrote to his friend Popper, you would not claim that scientists test every falsifiable theory if as many crazy theories crossed your desk as crossed mine. In short, judgments of coherence, simplicity, and the like are presupposed by physical science. Yet coherence and simplicity and the like are values. Indeed, each and every one of the arguments you've heard for relativism, or which I prefer to call radical contextualism in ethics, could be repeated in connection with these epistemic values without the slightest alteration. The argument that ethical values, every one of us has heard, that ethical values are metaphysically queer because inter alia we don't have a sense organ for detecting goodness, could be modified to read, epistemic values are ontologically queer because we do not have a sense organ for detecting simplicity and coherence. The familiar arguments for relativism, from the disagreements between cultures concerning values, arguments which are often driven by the fashionable but I believe wholly untenable picture of different cultures as incommensurable, one recently wonderfully bashed by the young American woman philosopher Michelle Moody Adams in a new book called Fieldwork in Familiar Places, could be modified to read that there are disagreements between cultures concerning what beliefs are more coherent, plausible, simpler as accounts of the facts, etc. And in both of the cases, the case of ethics and the case of science, there are those who would say that when cultures disagree, saying that one side is objectively right is mere rhetoric. In fact, that's the dominant strain in at least the radical wing of what's coming to be called postmodernism. With respect to this idea of the incommensurability of cultures, I cannot resist pointing out that when it comes to imperatives to abstain from pride and cruelty and hatred and oppression, you can find the same universalistic statements in ancient Egyptian literature that one hears today. For example, as Simone Weil wrote, "There's never been a more moving definition of virtue than the word spoken in the Book of the Dead by the soul on the way to salvation. Lord of truth, I have brought truth to thee, and I have destroyed wickedness for thee. I have not thought scorn of God. I have not brought forward my name for honors. I have not caused harm to be done to the servant by his master. I have made no one weep. I have not struck fear into any man. I have not spoken haughtily. I have not made myself deaf to the words of right and truth." That's in Simone Weil's selected essays. I have emphasized the fact that familiar arguments for relativism with respect to values would, if they were correct, apply to our epistemic values as well, because it's only by appreciating that fact that one can see just how self-refuting relativism actually is. Consider, for example, the views of Richard Rorty, a well-known philosopher who holds that we should scrap the whole notion of an objective world, an objective truth, objective views, and speak of views which our culture would accept. Sometimes he adds, at its best. Now, the view that all there is to values, including the epistemic values, because Rorty is a clever enough man to appreciate that the arguments for relativism don't just apply to ethical values, they apply to justification, epistemic values, but the view that all there is to values, including the epistemic ones, is what our culture thinks, presupposes that at least some of our common sense claims can be accepted without philosophical reinterpretation. For example, talk of cultures. When does talk of cultures make sense? Well, what has to be in place before you can even understand talk of cultures is the idea of other people. The idea of other people as having beliefs. In short, the idea of a common world has to be in place. If Rorty were to say, and I did once get him to say this in public at a conference, by the way, but he doesn't say it in print. If Rorty were to say the talk of other people is just marks and noises that help me cope, it would become obvious that his talk of the standards of our culture is empty by his own lights. Common sense realism about the views of my cultural peers, coupled with anti-realism about everything else, makes no sense. If, as Rorty likes to claim, the notion of an objective world makes no sense, then the notion of our culture cannot be more than Rorty's private fantasy. And if there's no such thing as objective justification, not even of claims about what other people believe, then Rorty's talk of solidarity with the views of our culture is mere rhetoric. Rorty, of course, would agree with my claim that scientific inquiry presupposes that we take seriously claims that are not themselves scientific, including value claims of many kinds. He would simply say that we should give up the notion that there's such a thing as objectivity, either in scientific or non-scientific inquiry. But at least some philosophers who want to hold on to the idea of scientific objectivity without admitting that science presupposes judgments which are not themselves scientific take a different tack. The only serious alternative, in fact, to admitting that the existence of warrantedly assertable claims as to matters that are non-scientific, that is, that there are warrantedly assertable claims as to what is more plausible than what, that there are warrantedly assertable claims as to what is more coherent than what, warrantedly assertable claims as to what is simpler than what. And the philosophers who want to deny that, or want to deny that such claims are presupposed by the activity of gathering knowledge, even in the paradigm science of physics, often appeal to an epistemology proposed by the American philosopher Alvin Goldman. It's called Reliabilist Epistemology. Although actually it's a forerunner of that was my PhD professor, Hans Reichenbach, in experience and prediction and his theory of probability. According to that epistemology, what makes a belief in science justified is that its acceptance was arrived at by a method which is reliable in the sense of having a high probability of resulting in the acceptance of true hypotheses. Now, technical objections have been made to this idea, and Goldman has made sophisticated alterations, sophisticated epicycles into the original formulation to meet the objections. But I don't want to get into these technicalities. The grounds on which I would argue this approach does not succeed are more historical. To see why, let's consider the question, on what method was Einstein relying when he accepted the special and general theories of relativity? Now, we know Einstein's own answer. He tells us that he arrived at the special theory of relativity by applying an empiricist critique to the notion of simultaneity. By the way, when he was asked, well, then why don't you apply, since you're troubled by quantum mechanics, why don't you apply an empiricist critique to the notions of quantum mechanics? By a friend, he wrote back, you know my view that Mach and Hume are a wonderful medicine for getting rid of nonsense, but they can't give you anything positive. And then having arrived at special relativity, he arrived at general relativity by seeking what he called the simplest theory of gravity compatible with special relativity in the infinitesimal domain. The difference between Einstein and Whitehead was over which was the simplest theory of gravity compatible with special relativity in the infinitesimal domain. By the way, if you want the details on Whitehead's theory, The Refutation was the work of C.M. Will. Relativistic Gravity in the Solar System 2, and in Astrophysics Journal for 1971, page 409 it starts. Now, the physicists who accepted these two theories regarded these as compelling considerations in their favor. But these two methods are completely topic-specific. So this is an aspect, by the way, of the thought of the 19th century philosopher of science, Comte, which is rarely mentioned. That Comte was usually regarded just as a proto-positivist, was in fact in many ways a founder of history of science, and the argument that each science developed its own specific topic-specific methods, that it's a mistake to look for the scientific method. By a kind of lowest common denominator method will not give you much. And moreover, both of these methods, since both Einstein and Whitehead thought they were applying the same second method, both of these methods presuppose judgments of reasonableness. And the entire physical community thought that Whitehead's way of applying it was unreasonable, although no one deduced a false prediction from Whitehead's theories, I say, till Will's paper in 1971. And judgments of reasonableness just don't fall into classes to which it's feasible to apply judgments of probability. We can't apply numerical judgments of probability when we don't know what the reference class is. We don't have a probability space. We don't have a sample class. We don't have reliable statistics. I mean, this whole discussion is a replay of Reichenbach versus Ernest Nagel, circa around 1945, 1949. Ernest Nagel's theory of probability rejects Reichenbach's reliabilism, which wasn't called that, on just this grounds. In sum, not only is there no reason to think that the sorts of judgments I've been talking about, judgments of reasonableness, can be reduced to non-normative judgments, there is not even a serious sketch of such a reduction. Well, we come to objectivity, which of course is what everyone talks about. The claim that judgments of fact presuppose judgments of value has been around at least since John Dewey. And if you want to start reading Dewey, I like myself very much Dewey and Tufts' Ethics, which was the most widely used book in ethics in the United States until World War II and disappeared after World War II. It's a great shame because Dewey's ethics dealt with real problems like male chauvinism, racism, discusses Bolshevism. In explaining why he rejects Bolshevism or communism, he says, my disagreement with Marx isn't about class struggle. I believe in class struggle. Just I don't believe violence is going to make a better society. And moreover, I think the communists are confusing two things. They think that when you've nationalized something, you socialized. And and after World War II, we got ethics books in which the typical ethical problem was about which do you save when 25 children are drowning at the same time. And so, something rather strange happened. But I also like Dewey's book. If you want see Dewey on both ethics and science, The Quest for Certainty is a wonderful book. Anyway, the fact that the claim that judgments of fact presuppose judgments of value makes one wonder why that claim has been ignored for so many decades. I think the real source of our difficulties is the crudity of the notions of objectivity that are so often brought to these discussions. Let's begin by thinking about how we judge objectivity when we're not trying to do metaphysics. Normally, we call, and against the charge, what are you, an unreconstructed ordinary language philosopher? It's like, well, when I first read Austin back in the late 50s, I wasn't convinced that philosophy ought to be about ordinary language, but I was sure convinced that good philosophy can be done in ordinary language. And when you consistently have to violate the way we normally understand a term, something is wrong with your suspicions about your argument. Well, how do we normally judge objectivity? I think normally we ask questions like this. Is the statement being made from an idiosyncratic standpoint? Is the person making the statement showing due regard for other relevant interests and standpoints? Now, a sufficient condition that an ethical claim be objective in its ordinary sense is that it be reasonable from the standpoint of an interest in the common welfare, where the common welfare need not be thought of as something already handed down. The alternative possibility is to think of the common welfare as something that we agree to be determined by intelligent discussion among the persons who share this very commitment. I want to emphasize this is something that I suggest only as a sufficient condition, and by no means a necessary one. Value judgments are not a homogeneous class, and there are different sorts of objectivity. But I will concentrate on ethical claims of this kind, sometimes claims about the common welfare, sometimes called claims in political ethics or claims in social ethics. If an ethical claim of this sort is accepted by those affected at the end of experimentation and intelligent discussion, then it will be what John Dewey called a warrantedly assertable claim, as long as reasons to question it do not arise. And the similarity, and I would stress the similarity between asking the question, what beliefs are acceptable from the standpoint of persons who are, one, concerned to be able to justify their beliefs to other persons, and two, to do so by appeal to standards that other persons who share that very concern cannot reasonably reject. That's the question we ask, for example, when we do science. And the questions, what actions are justifiable from the standpoint of persons who are concerned to be able to justify their actions to other persons, and to do so by appeal to standards that other persons who share that very concern cannot reasonably reject, the question we ask when we do social ethics. These concerns, like the concern with cognitive values and the concern with ethical values in general, presuppose one another. But this is not the way philosophers nowadays are thinking of objectivity. More often than not, I run into philosophers who attempt to define objective by phrases like, and I'm quoting from recent papers, reality has an existence and character wholly independent of human practices, beliefs, and evidence. Or, quotes, something being the case is independent of how anyone would regard it. Such definitions are philosophers' blinkers rather than workable conceptions. In fact, it seems to me that in contrast with the ordinary use of the word objective I described before, objective seems to be used by philosophers today somewhat as cognitively meaningful, used to be used by logical positivists as a term for claims which really, metaphysically or ontology, have a truth value. But the definitions I just quoted are failures in their own terms, in metaphysical realist terms. For example, with regard to something's being the case is independent of how anyone would regard it. Haven't these philosophers noticed that reality does not have an existence and character wholly independent of human practices, beliefs, and evidence? Isn't it the case that human practices, beliefs, and evidence are a very large part of the reality we talk about, and that reality would be quite different were they different? Well, perhaps causal independence is not what is meant. But then I don't know what is meant. Metaphysical realists often insist that a truly objective statement is one whose truth has, quotes, no connection with warranted assertability, actual or possible. But this, too, is just a philosophical shibboleth, because there are many statements for which truth is conceptually connected to warranted assertability under appropriate conditions. And these include many statements which metaphysical realists would class as objective. That there are mountains in the area bounded by 70 degrees west and 75 degrees west and by 40 degrees north and 45 degrees north is an objective fact, if anything is. But given that it's part of the concept of a mountain, that mountains are big enough to see, it necessarily follows that if there are mountains in that area, and if appropriate conditions exist, people who know their own latitude and longitude are there to see them, and there's nothing to interfere with their seeing the mountains, etc., it will be warrantedly assertable that there are mountains in the area in question. Perhaps conceptual independence is not what is meant either. I think it's no accident that metaphysical realists never do tell us what they mean by independent. that in such a case, my mountains case, and in the case of most ordinary statements about observable things, there are people in this room, for example, truth, realist truth, if you please, and warranted assertability under appropriate conditions coincide is no accident. To understand the claim that there's a mountain in a certain place, I must know what a mountain is. And normally this means knowing what mountains look like. Grasp of the content of a claim and grasp of its verification conditions are conceptually related for many claims, even if they're not the same. Moreover, such extreme requirements for objectivity as total independence from what human beings could do or could know or believe are irrelevant to ethics from the start. No ethicist except a rampant Platonist, and I myself sometimes wonder whether Plato was a rampant Platonist, would say that whether he was a rampant Platonist, would say that what is right and wrong is independent of human nature. Or more particularly, no ethicist would say that what's right and wrong is totally independent of how human beings who are raised in a community with a moral tradition would regard things, or very few ethicists would. Certainly Aristotle did not hold that what is right for human beings to do or right for them to be is, quote, independent of how human beings would regard it in any and all circumstances. He constantly appeals in his ethics to facts about how human beings would regard things. Yet it's decidedly odd to suppose that the sort of objectivity Aristotle sees ethical statements as having, which as he says at the beginning is different from the kind of objectivity that statements in geometry have. But to say that Aristotle was not a realist in ethics would be decidedly odd, or not a cognitivist. For these and other reasons too numerous to go into now, I find the attempt to force us to classify our beliefs as objective or subjective, and then the assumptions that get made, tacitly usually, about which beliefs are which, and made tacitly or explicitly about what follows if a belief is put in this box or this box, decidedly objectionable. Usually philosophy suffers at any given period from this problem of too few boxes. I mean, when I started the work, that really led to my career, the first paper in which I found my own voice, the Analytic and the Synthetic, was stimulated really by suggestion by another junior faculty member, Sylvan Bromberger, that you have too few boxes. A pressing task for philosophy, as I see it, is to challenge these classifications so that we may see the terrain without the distortions which they produce. How are objective ethical claims possible? Well, by now, I hope to have convinced you that the denial of the very possibility of objective value claims threatens to turn into a denial of the very possibility of a reasonable, ordinary language sort of objectivity. But I know this will not shake the confidence in the fact-value dichotomy of people who have come to see that dichotomy as inseparable from modern scientific sophistication. I believe that the first person, he was a great thinker and a great human being, to eloquently defend the idea that we have to give up the idea that there can be value objectivity was Max Weber in his Science as a Vocation. He said in an elegiac and regretful tone that we are, quote, we moderns are, quote, committed to a pluralism, to a polytheism of ultimate values. But I believe, although I have enormous respect for Weber, that he was wrong. Such people may agree, that we should not think of objectivity in the way in which metaphysical realists think of it. Weber certainly would have. But they don't see how value judgments in ethics can have any sort of objectivity at all. In their view, acceptance of a fact-value dichotomy is part of the epistemology that goes with modern science. I think Weber's case, there was another reason, which is he was constantly torn about whether he should leave his wife for his mistress or stay with his wife. And I think part of the subtext in Science as a Vocation is that Kant's ethics can't help me make that decision. However, this I learned from Dan Bell. I've already alluded to the crudest of the epistemological defenses of the fact-value dichotomy, which runs like this. How can there be objective ethical values? We can say how we detect yellow. We have eyes. But what sense organs do we have for detecting value? What makes that crude is its naivete about perception. Perceptions of yellow may indeed be pretty minimally conceptually informed. I tend to think they're more conceptually informed than, say, Chris Peacock does, but it's a hard question. But consider the parallel question: how could we come to tell that people are elated? After all, we have no sense organ for detecting elation. We can tell that other people are elated, and sometimes we can even see that other people are elated. In fact, in the case of elation, more often than not. But we can do so only after we've acquired the concept of elation. Perception is not innocent. It's an exercise of our concepts, an exercise of what Kant called our spontaneity. Once I have acquired the concept of elation, I can see that someone is elated. And similarly, once I've acquired the concept of a friendly person, I can see sometimes that someone is friendly. Or of a malicious person, I can see that someone is malicious. Or of a kind person, I can see that someone is kind. To be sure, such judgments are fallible. But the idea that because they're fallible, they must really be inferences from some other judgments which are infallible is a move that philosophers have long given up making. As pragmatists in particular have never believed in infallibility, either in perception or anywhere else. As Peirce once put it, in science we don't have a firm foundation, and we don't need one. We're on swampy ground, but that's what keeps us moving. If you take one thing home from this talk, take that one. Connected with the idea that to know that there are values, we would need to have a special sense organ, is the old empiricist psychology, according to which perceptual experience is value neutral as opposed to emotion, and values are added to experience by projection. In a variant of this idea, notice all these ideas depend on the idea of separate, non-interpenetrating mental faculties. Perception supplies reason with neutral facts, and value comes from the will. Now, this empiricist psychology has been sharply criticized by a number of authors, one of the best being Iris Murdoch in her early philosophical books. And the American pragmatists in particular have always emphasized that experience isn't neutral. It comes to a screaming with values. In infancy, we experience food and drink and cuddling and warmth as good, and pain and deprivation and loneliness as bad. And as our experiences multiply and become more sophisticated, the tinges and shades of value also multiply and become more sophisticated. Think, for example, of a wine taster's description of an Australian wine. A little peach. And maybe some Pepto-Bismol. However, the pragmatists do not make the error of supposing that merely being valued as a matter of experiential fact suffices to make something valuable. No distinction is more insistent in John Dewey's writing than the distinction between the valued and the valuable. You'll find that one in The Quest for Certainty as elsewhere. Between the desired and the desirable. Dewey's answer to the question, well, what makes something valuable as opposed to merely being valued, in a word, is criticism. Objective value arises not from a special sense organ, but from the criticism of our valuings. Valuings are incessant and inseparable from all of our activities, including our scientific ones, but it is by intelligent reflection on our valuings, intelligent reflection of the kind that Dewey calls criticism, that we conclude that some of them are warranted while others are unwarranted. Philosophy is described by Dewey as criticism of criticism. But this leads to the next question. By what criteria do we decide that some valuings are warranted and some unwarranted? With this question, we enter more sophisticated levels of the epistemological issue. What I shall present, as I have been doing, is John Dewey's answer, which it's convenient to divide into three parts. 1. In judging the outcome of an inquiry, whether it be an inquiry into what are conventionally called facts or into what are conventionally considered to be values, we always bring to bear a large stock of both valuations and descriptions which are not in question in that inquiry. We're never in the position imagined by the positivists of having a large stock of factual beliefs and no value judgments, and of having to decide whether our very first value judgment is warranted. We're never in the position of having to infer our very first ought from a whole lot of ises. 2, we neither have nor require one single criterion, as the question suggests, for judging warranted assertability in ethics any more than we do in any other area. I should say in ethics any more than in science. In particular, the authority of philosophy is not the authority of a field vested with knowledge or pretended knowledge of such a criterion or set of criteria. As Dewey himself put it, as philosophy has no private store of knowledge or methods for attaining truth, so it has no private access to good. As it accepts knowledge and principles from those competent in science and inquiry, it accepts the goods that are diffused in human experience. It has no Mosaic or Pauline authority of revelation entrusted to it, but it has the authority of intelligence, of criticism of these common and natural goods. 3, with the appearance of the term intelligence, we come to the last part of Dewey's answer to the by what criteria question. If Dewey does not believe that inquiry requires criteria in the sense of decision procedures or algorithms, either in the sciences or in daily life, he does believe that there are some things we have learned about inquiry from the conduct of inquiry. In our writing on Dewey, Ruth Anna Putnam and I have insisted that if one thing distinguishes Dewey as an ethicist or meta-ethicist, and for him the distinction collapses, it is his emphasis on the importance of and his consistent application of the idea that what holds good for inquiry in general holds for value inquiry in particular. But what does hold good for inquiry in general? We've learned Deweyans insist that inquiry, which is to make full use of human intelligence, has to have certain characteristics, including the characteristics which I've elsewhere referred to by the phrase, the democratization of inquiry. And I'm happy to acknowledge the influence of Jürgen Habermas in that phrase, as well as of Dewey. For example, intelligent inquiry obeys the principles of what Habermas calls discourse ethics. It does not block the paths of inquiry by preventing the raising of questions and objections, nor obstruct the formulation of hypotheses and criticism of the hypotheses of others. At its best, it avoids relations of hierarchy and dependence. It insists upon experimentation where possible, and observation and close analysis of observation where experiment is impossible. By appeal to these and kindred standards, we can often tell that views are irresponsibly defended in ethics as well as in science. Not everyone will be convinced, I know. Some of the undergraduates in a class I taught last year suggested that belief in giving reasons and actually observing how various ways of life have functioned in practice, what the consequences have been, discussing objections, etc., is, quote, just another form of fundamentalism. The experience of these students with real fundamentalism must be rather limited. Anyone who's seen real fundamentalists in action knows the difference between insisting on observation and discussion and the repressive and suppressive mode of conducting discussion that is characteristic of fundamentalism. But in any case, I think that this objection was both anticipated and adequately responded to by the founder of pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, in his famous essay, The Fixation of Belief. The discovery that inquiry, which is to be successful in the long run, requires observation and experimentation and public discussion of the results of that observation and experimentation, is not something a priori, but is itself something that we learn from observation and experimentation with different methods of conducting inquiry. Such methods and the failure of such methods as the method of tenacity, the method of just stick to what daddy and granddaddy and grandgranddaddy and so on always believed, the method of authority, and the method of appeal to allegedly a priori reason. well, it's time to conclude. I said at the outset that the distinction between science and non-scientific knowledge is fuzzy. But even the two cases that I've considered, in this talk I've considered what I will call the science-related case, that is choosing between theories in advance of any crucial experiment, or when a crucial experiment is not possible, or as far as we know not possible, and the case of social ethics. Even these two cases illustrate one aspect of the distinction between scientific and non-scientific knowledge. While judgments of reasonableness, coherence, plausibility, simplicity, and the like are presupposed by science, they're not often thematized by science. Whereas in the non-scientific case, they're likely to be the explicit subject matter of our controversies and discussions. Textbooks of physics do not very often contain statements to the effect that one theory is more reasonable than another, although in periods of scientific revolution they may, whereas essays on ethical and political questions constantly contain claims of this sort. I've argued that judgments of reasonableness can be objective. That does not mean they're totally independent of what human beings can know and do. Reasonableness means reasonableness for human beings, and invariably for human beings in a particular context. On the other hand, the view that there's no more to reasonableness than what one's particular culture believes leads immediately to paradox. For since our own culture does not believe that cultural relativism is correct as a general view of truth and justification, it follows from cultural relativism itself that cultural relativism is neither true nor justified. Rorty, of course, hopes to change this state of affairs, which is awkward from his point of view. But I don't think he will succeed. In brief, reasonableness is relative to context, including culture, but not simply what a culture takes to be reasonable. Also, I've argued in various books and papers, and again in good pragmatist fashion, that the fact that we cannot reduce reasonableness to an algorithm does not mean a computer program, does not mean we cannot say a good deal about it. Some of you may have noticed that the kind of objectivity I claimed for one sort of ethical claim was objectivity from within the ethical life. I did not deal with the vexed issue of whether there's a sense in which the choice of the ethical life itself is, quote, subjectively right. My own view is that there is, but that's not an issue I needed to discuss for my purposes tonight. In this respect, my strategy tonight followed the so-called constructivist strategy of John Rawls and Thomas Scanlon. I mentioned at the outset that I've been writing and lecturing about these topics for over 2 decades. There's one topic that I've invariably discussed in my courses, which has not yet entered into my discussion tonight, and I want to close by rectifying that omission. In my courses, I've always discussed at some length the curious fashion in which recent disputes about the objectivity of meaning facts, for example, Quine's famous claim that translation and reference are indeterminate. Discussions of that claim exactly parallel the older disputes about the objectivity of value claims, particularly of ethical claims. Incidentally, in Bernard Williams' book, Descartes, they are explicitly linked. Interestingly, almost every move that's ever been made in the dispute over ethics has been repeated in the dispute over Quine's claim that there are no meaning facts. I have in my course, Non-Scientific Knowledge, I have the students read Quine on the indeterminacy of translation, and then Williams and others on ethics. For example, corresponding to the utilitarian attempt to give ethics objectivity by reducing ethical claims to natural scientific claims, e.g. claims about pleasure, which the utilitarians thought of as something we'd eventually be able to measure. There are the attempts by such philosophers as Fred Dretske and Jerry Fodor to reduce meaning claims to claims about causal probabilistic covariation. There's a good review in that literature in the new Blackwell's Companion to the Philosophy of Language, by the way, the article by Terence Horgan on naturalizing semantics. The idea is that in some way the fact that the word cat refers to cats is supposed to be reduced to the alleged facts that tokenings of the word cat co-vary with occurrences of cats. And corresponding to the non-cognitivist strategy of denying that there's such a thing as an ethical fact, there's the Quinean strategy of denying that there's any such thing as a meaning fact. Ethical claims are just expressions of feeling, according to the emotivists. Meaning claims are just expressions of a decision to translate a discourse one way rather than another, a decision which may be convenient or inconvenient, but not scientifically right or wrong, for Quine. Of course, Quine also believes there are no ethical facts, and he's expressed skepticism about confirmation, that is, the objectivity of scientific justification. What keeps him from postmodernism is only his positivist faith in prediction as the sole touchstone of objectivity. In sum, if ethical questions are not the subject matter of a so-called mature science, they've got a surprising number of companions in the guilt. Justification, coherence, simplicity, and now meaning and reference all exhibit the same problems that ethical predicates do from an epistemological and metaphysical point of view. Nor is this something to be wondered at, for like ethical predicates, all of them have to do with reasonableness in action, in belief, and in interpretation. And it is the refusal to tolerate any sort of objectivity that is not underwritten by a grand metaphysical narrative that leads to the corrosive skepticism that we find with respect to each of them in at least some fashionable quarters today. In this respect, in spite of all its attack on grand metaphysical narratives, postmodernism is often just the skeptical face of the metaphysical itch. In 1982, I published a paper called Beyond the Fact-Value Dichotomy that I read to the first meeting of my course, Non-Scientific Knowledge, each time I give the class. It has become, so to speak, my manifesto, and I shall close with a few sentences adapted from it. It's reprinted in my book, Realism with a Human Face, by the way. Where are we then? On the one hand, the idea that science, in the sense of exact science, exhausts rationality is seen to be a self-stultifying error. The very activity of arguing about the nature of rationality presupposes a notion of rationality wider than that of laboratory testability. If there's no fact of the matter about what cannot be tested by deriving predictions, then there's no fact of the matter about any philosophical statement, including that one. On the other hand, any conception of rationality broad enough to embrace philosophy, not to mention linguistics, mentalistic psychology, history, clinical psychology, etc., must embrace much that is vague, ill-defined, and no more capable of being scientized than was the knowledge of our ancestors. The horror of what cannot be methodized is nothing but method fetishism. It is time we got over it. Getting over it would reduce our intellectual hubris. We might even recover our sense of mystery. Who knows? Thank you.